Okay, welcome back to session 4. I'm Russell Berman, and this is War Today. I'm going to remind the speakers to speak really closely into the microphone, and I think we'll proceed with the pattern that Adrian started in the past session. I will give you each 15 minutes. Unlike Adrian, I will cruelly cut you off after 15 minutes. He's such a nice guy, right? But then we'll have 5 minutes or so for immediate questions. Maybe take 1 or 2 for each speaker, and then we'll still have time at the end for general discussion. So our first speaker is Carl Mirra from Adelphi University, who is speaking on From Mezhyhirya to Slavyansk, Reconsidering the Origins of War and the Subversion of Peace in the Russo-Ukrainian War. Carl.
Thank you. All right. I'm not sure if this paper is, can you hear? Okay. I'm not sure if this paper is calibrated to this crowd. I'm not a philosopher. There's not a lot of theory in this. It's more of the practical details. So maybe you can give me some indication if it's getting very boring for you or simplistic, and I'll try to raise the level of sophistication, but keep in mind there's a threshold on that level as well. Okay. If it is theoretical, it follows what's called critical geopolitics, and what they talk about is a thin geopolitics. And what I see, what I'm perceiving in the understanding of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a U.S. Western-centric lens for understanding the conflict that really loses sight of the regional and local political situation, and that without really getting into the nitty-gritty detail of that, it's quite distorted, even for those who support the war. So I'm going to try to unpack a little of that. So my title, you may also see, is a little bit overbaked. People know what that's referring to?
No.
No, thank you. The first is the residence of Viktor Yanukovych, who was ousted in 2014, and it was an opulent residence. He had a big golden loaf of bread. It was actually like this big, all gold. So it represents the opulence of his administration. And that might sound silly and unimportant, but that has a lot to do with why he was removed from his presidency. That has nothing to do with outside powers. That's important to keep in mind, because it's understood as, you know, the U.S. or some other outside force must have had something to do with his removal. I'll save that for later. And the other, Slavyansk, is where the war started. I traveled to Slavyansk to conduct oral history and surveys. Well, there are a lot of conspiracy theories running around Slavyansk, and there's a guy, Igor Girkin, who was a former FSB officer, who I asked about Girkin. I won't repeat what they said, but there was a lot of curse words, and the statement that Russians were here long before Girkin, that he's not the catalyst behind this, that we've been infiltrated long before that. Whether that's true or not, I have no means of knowing, but lots of people said that. So that's why I'm starting from those frame of references, the local, and then work out to the general, because I see, and people, when I say I've gone to Ukraine, whether they're left, right, moderates, will invariably ask, why would you do that? As so this is somehow an unimportant conflict for us to be concerned about. Not folks like you who are thinkers, but for the general community. So anyway, I had a set of research questions. I won't go through all of them at all. But basically what I'm looking at is how Russian disinformation, while we might laugh at fake news and laugh at disinformation, the means by which we frame the war in a very subtle way may feed Russian disinformation, right? Because we're seeing it from a very limited perspective. That'll make more sense, hopefully, by the end of my presentation. The U.S. Committee on Foreign Affairs produced a study in 2018 on Kremlin disinformation, and they came up with something like 8 master narratives. I focus on 2 of those master narratives for a very specific reason. One of them is that Russia is a victim of Western imperialism, or really NATO encroachment, NATO expansion, that the unilateral, unipolar West dominates the globe, and we're just a regional power, in the words of Obama, and there should be some sort of multipolar system. That seems on the surface as a very sensible foreign policy, at least regionally speaking, but as we unpack that, it's really not. And then the other is that the U.S. has a history of destabilizing regimes. Kermit Roosevelt wrote a book how he helped destabilize Iran in the 1950s, right? So this is well known across the world. In Russia, they manipulate that. And then it's argued that the U.S. was responsible for the ouster of the democratically elected, highly corrupt, vicious Viktor Yanukovych. This may be very simplistic to you, but that narrative, without looking at the reasons why he was removed, I don't think there'll ever be, or why NATO encroachment makes such little sense, we will ever find a durable conflict settlement. That's really where I'm headed. There can never be a durable conflict settlement if we understand it through a U.S. or Western lens, even a sympathetic U.S. Western lens. And furthermore, I'm interested in this because there's an ascendancy, as many have noted here, of a far right and far left in U.S. politics. And the far left and far right, many studies have shown, Harvard Kennedy School of Government did a study, are susceptible or vulnerable to Russian propaganda. And the U.S. support, while strong for Ukraine, is waning a bit. At the start of the war versus now, there's a 19-point increase in people saying the U.S. is providing too much aid to Ukraine. I'm getting into all the details of the people and what they said. I'm not going to have time. But the misrepresentations of the cause of war may undermine support. Then there's talk. There was a committee meeting with Secretary Austin of the Senate, and they were complaining that our stockpiles are very, very depleted. And Lieutenant Colonel here will get into details on that, and that 1/3 of our javelins have been depleted. So combined with the sense that a long war tends to wear American population down, we saw that in Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, and that our stockpiles are declining, there's reason to deconstruct the narratives around this war. So what I did is I created a chart. I was going to put it up on the PowerPoint. I don't think this is a PowerPoint crowd, so I vetoed that idea. Okay, I made the right choice, I think. But what I attempted to do, and this might be way too simplistic for this crowd, and stop me if it is, I did paired examples of NATO expansion versus Russia's reaction. There's no doubt that NATO is a security threat to Russia, right? That would be obscene to say that it isn't. But Russia, I will argue, inflates that threat, and inflates it in such a way that allows it to pursue its own aggressive, irredentist foreign policy, so on and so forth. I'll skip over the 1 inch. We all know the 1 inch line and how that's been manipulated, so on and so forth. But starting in 1993, Yeltsin met with the Polish president, supposedly always vodka in this. It's really true, too. It's over vodka. They released a statement saying that Poland entering NATO is not a threat to Moscow, and that he generally supported it. His foreign minister, Kozyrev, tells a story about this, and he helped him to rewrite it so it was a little less conciliatory. But at the end of the day, Russia was saying Poland entering NATO is not against our security interests. That's 1993, much different time. Tanks in Kremlin, so on and so forth. We'll get into that. But in 1995, Mary Surratt wrote a book called Not 1 Inch. Yale historian, really an expert on this, released a lot of the documents. We're all grateful to her. There's a document of Bill Clinton and Yeltsin. Is actually this really paradigmatic, or an example of really how NATO expansion occurred, with Moscow accelerating it and aiding and abetting it. That's really my argument. Moscow helped make NATO expansion happen. That's what's different. Should have mentioned that in the beginning. In that meeting in 1995, May 1995, Clinton meets with Yeltsin. They had a pretty good relationship. And Yeltsin asks him, can you delay NATO expansion to after my election? Bill Clinton agrees, but says, you know what? We can't let the press know this. And Yeltsin goes, no way, we can't let the press know this. We'll present that you didn't capitulate to NATO and I didn't slow the process down, because Republicans were clamoring for the expansion of NATO at the time. And then Yeltsin says to him, quite literally, we'll tell the Central and Eastern Europeans later that they can have NATO. So in 1995, he sold NATO for election votes. And that's a series, a pattern, I would say, that occurs with enough regularity through Yeltsin and Putin that I'm not just cherry picking the record. Another famous event is in 1999. NATO admits 3 new members, Czech, Hungary, and Poland, in March, on March 12th. But everybody's probably thinking what happened in March 1999, right? In the Balkans, there was, right? Kosovo was bombed. Primakov, the foreign minister, was supposedly flying to the United States. He turned the plane around midair, came back, a lot of drama. Putin, Yeltsin said, we'll never cooperate with the West again. Less than 3 months later, in June at the G8 summit, Yeltsin announced, the fighting is over. We must make friends again. So suddenly, again, you have this conflict and confrontation versus reset. And what was at stake there wasn't an election, it was IMF loans, over $4 billion of IMF loans that we would soon learn within a couple months that there was a scheme of depositing those loans in a New York bank and then skimming them, and Yeltsin used those for his campaign. So on 2 occasions, for election favors and for an IMF loan scheme, they aided and abetted the expansion of NATO. Tell me this, I got a lot of examples. I'll try to go through them quick. In 2022, there was a NATO and Ukraine partnership, sort of erased from history that this has been going on for quite some time. That announced a deeper, more comprehensive relationship. And actually, there's a lot of, the conspiracy theories. There's a NATO base in Ukraine, outside of Lviv, there's a NATO base. It's sort of true. NATO does train there. And in 2002, the US forces trained with Ukrainian forces. But Putin's reaction wasn't, this is an existential threat, we need to go to war and get rid of the artificial state of Ukraine. His reaction was, every state has a right to choose its security alliance of its choice, and that's between NATO and Ukraine. So about the worst case scenario happened in 2002. Of course, the world was different. At that time, that was post 9/11. There was, concern about combating terrorism and so on, so I don't want to be too reductionist. Through this, should do 2004 as well. This is very important. It's the largest expansion in NATO history. 7 new countries were admitted in 2004. 10 countries of Europe became part of the European Union. On top of that, they gave them deep and comprehensive free trade agreements. So this, obviously, Moscow was not pleased, and they registered complaints about it. But on 2 occasions, Putin was asked by the world media, you can Lexis Uni it, you'll see it comes up hundreds of times, is this not a threat to Russia? Basically, that's not the exact question, but it's pretty close. And he said it's not a threat. We view NATO as a positive development. Okay, that's 2 occasions that happened. So if there was ever a moment to register the existential threat, it was when the largest expansion all Eastern European countries occurred. No such registering of threat occurred. Okay. The far left and right use what really emerged from Sputnik and RIA Novosti, the Russian news, a telegram from William Burns, who was then U.S. ambassador to Moscow, that states this is Ukraine and Georgia being in NATO is a red line. It's seen as a threat. But he concluded that memo saying, but it's used to rally support from hardliners. And then he went on to write another memo because they're seeking to increase their military industrial budget. That's always left out of the conversation. Okay, moving along. And this is really the fascinating part for me. Not only did they aid and abet for loan schemes and for election favors, 2011, Dmitry Rogozin, who was the Russian ambassador to NATO, publicly announced, nobody's hiding this, it's in the public record, you can go look it up, that a priority for Russia was to increase, wrap your head around this, defense industry cooperation with NATO. Increase defense industry cooperation with NATO. Robo-Baron Export, it's the state conglomerate defense country, they travel to NATO countries to sell NATO weapons. Okay, they do the 30, 40 times they've probably done that. It turns out that not only was it a priority in 2011, it turns out as far back as 2005, they were selling Mi-17 helicopters, which can be weaponized. They have 7.62 guns on them, to NATO for Afghanistan war, a country that once bordered the Soviet Union, right? And they gave helicopters, they allowed them to use their airspace. This is what well-known type of thing. So for about a decade, Russia was cooperating its defense industry with NATO for a NATO war in its neighborhood, right? And then turns around and says it's a threat. On top of that, Rogozin said, there's 400 helicopters in Eastern Europe that are outdated, need to be militarized and fixed. And they signed contracts with Eastern European countries right up to 2013. In fact, one of them into 2014. In 2013, Sputnik reported that the Robo-Baron Export, which is the state-run military contractor in Russia, made a deal to sell helicopters again to the U.S., to the Pentagon. That's 5 months before Yanukovych's ouster, maybe about 6 months before the outbreak of war. And that same fall, Operation Vigilant Skies occurred, which was a joint U.S., NATO, Russia military exercise. And the Russian general who participated said, this shows we have a trusted relationship with NATO. That's September 2013.
2 more minutes.
2 more. Oh my goodness, I'm just getting started. All right. So the point I'm trying to make is the narrative, and it's important to really deconstruct it specifically, that NATO is somehow a threat to Moscow. It is on some level, but it bargained away that threat. Was it thinking about what was the cost and benefit to its security interests? Was it thinking about the predictable consequences of that? Was it even looking at the worst case scenarios of that behavior? No, it's sacrificed all of its security needs for personal aggrandizement, military contracts, and election favors. The next part I want to get into was the start of the war. I'll just get this. I'm going to do this in 1 minute. I don't know if the names Gurkhan, Borodai, Malafiev, and Dmitry Sablin mean anything to anybody, but they traveled. They're all Russian citizens. One is a former FSB officer, and they all reported to Surkov, who was a presidential advisor, and Glaslev, who was a presidential advisor to Putin. And they stirred up trouble in Crimea. They were there in January 2014, and then somehow they traveled their way to Donetsk in April. And Gurkhan, there's a famous statement, says he triggered the war. That people were peaceful and weren't interested in fighting, that people were working out on the beach, not on the beach, were working out in the street, whatever, and he helped trigger the war. There's others who confirm that. But even to complicate it, one last thing, there's a lot of information I'm going to try to rush through here. But Pavel Gubarev, I don't know if you noticed that he was the first governor of the next People Republic. And this is really an example of the larger trends. I can give 10 examples like this. And he said that people were not in a warlike state in March, April 2014. But he got a phone call. And these phone calls were leaked, not this particular phone call, from Sergei Glaslev, who's a longtime politician in Russia and was a presidential advisor to Putin at the time. And he said that he told him that Russia supports him, that he encouraged him. And he said he no longer felt alone, and now he was in the warlike spirit. So a call from Putin's presidential advisor inspired Pavel Gubarev to go to war, just like a former FSB officer, Gurkhan, started a war. But Gubarev is also important because he helps understand the causes of war have nothing to do with the West. The ouster of Yanukovych has nothing to do with the West. He was criticizing Yanukovych, and he represents, there were protests in the summer and fall 2013 throughout Donetsk and in the area, resisting the oligarchs who were shutting down factories. And Gubarev says it's no surprise that Yanukovych unleashed this thing. One other thing I can give one other thing I'm getting, those leaks also showed a document on a set of measures to implore Ukraine to not sign European, to join the Eurasian Economic Forum, whatever you want to call it. And in those measures, because the narrative is the U.S. overthrew Yanukovych, but Russia was planning to oust. Russia said that Yanukovych is ignorant. His policies appear too pro-Russian. It's turning the population against him. We will wait for his ouster, and we will bring in a new set of leaders, probably from South and Eastern Ukraine. That's literally in the document that was revealed in the Frolov leaks, really. That's just the tip of the iceberg. So my point here being is that if you look on the ground at what's happening, most of the narratives about the war, even sympathetic ones, see it through a U.S. lens. And we will never have a conflict settlement because Russia's goal, if you look at these leaks, Surkov leaks and so on, is to destabilize Ukraine through federalization. So to a person, I asked about 100 people, maybe 200 people in Ukraine, should you give up territory? Maybe give up 10 feet of your territory to end this thing. Not a single person said, yes, we should. Not a single person said that. Because they understand that Russia sees them as an artificial state. Medvedev, who's the former president, prime minister, head of the Security Council, said Ukraine might not be on a map in 2 years, right? So Ukrainians understand that, and when you get down to the nitty-gritty level, the idea that the U.S. can end this war, the idea that big powers can end this war, really doesn't make a lot of sense. Because Ukrainians themselves know that they're fighting for their survival, and this got me all worked up from arguing with leftists on my campus. You're supposed to believe in anti-imperialism, and here's a real great opportunity to really live that, and they do the opposite. But anyway, thank you for letting me go over it.
Okay, we can take 2 questions, please, here, and then Marcia after you.
A quick question, because is this on? Yeah, you were saying you're about your point, but but the whole first part of it is that Russia is conceding on NATO all the way, and you gave all these examples. And then suddenly at the end, Russia is doing its best to destabilize Ukraine when it, as you say, NATO is a destabilizing force. So basically, I mean, I think there's something missing here. The first part of it seemed to be, all that Russia is conceding on NATO, even though it's going to get involved in Ukraine. And the second point is, boom, Putin is causing this war. And, so why was they conceding on Ukraine all the time? I mean, the two parts don't seem to go together. There was one argument
That's a
about
good question.
NATO,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then it seems to change.
Yeah. Put the pieces together.
You want to go ahead?
Yes.
Please.
Okay. I guess to answer that, I would say that what's missing from that is that I'm making the point that Russia did not invade Ukraine because NATO is a legitimate security threat. It wasn't truly a security imperative. It wasn't truly a national security interest. It invaded Ukraine. This will make a lot of sense to everybody. It's because not just Putin, but many, many Russians can't get over the fact that they lost a whole lot of their territory in 1991, that they were defeated and they were no longer considered a viable empire, that they are weak and on their knees. We know Putin can't come to terms. I wrote an essay in July 2021 basically calling Ukraine an artificial state. He said it at Munich as well. So what I'm saying is that what's missing is Russia would invade even if the U.S. packed up and went home. I would go so far as say even if NATO didn't exist, because Putin we're getting to what do they believe type of thing. I don't think it's such a stress. He believes Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia are spiritually connected. I don't think that's so crazy. There's some people who told me whose homes, or the apartment building was blown up. I could show you the pictures. I'm Soviet, I'm Russian my whole life, but not after this. Right? So it's a complicated matter. What's missing is the fact that Russia was invading for its own imperial agenda. We can debate. Fiona Hill says he's not trying to reunite the USSR. He's really a 19th century czar. He's trying to rebuild the empire. But that's what I think is missing.
Marcia, please.
Hi, that's a related question, right? We have to promote the decision is a moment again. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, yeah.
Okay, so there we go. So it's a related question. I listened to the first 2/3 of your talk, and I was thinking, what made the change? What you just said was that it's an ideological passion that made the flip from all these years of cooperation with NATO and the U.S. unto defense cooperation. And then there's a switch in 2014 when they invade Ukraine. I'm asking myself why. You just responded to the previous question by saying it's an ideological passion for the lost territory, the lost empire, what you will. And I'm wondering if anything, what else was going on there? Were the economic factors? Were there agricultural factors? Were there demographic factors? Was anything else? What else was involved in what appears from your talk to be a radical shift, almost an incomprehensible shift? And to your point that NATO isn't a true security risk. When we talk about security risks, why would NATO be one for Russia? Is it only proximity? Because it's my understanding that it's not proximity that creates a security risk. We've been proximate to Canada for a really long time, and we don't run around being terrified that the Canadians are going to invade. It's not mere proximity that makes for a security risk. A country needs to feel some threat to their interests or that people want in. My understanding is nobody wants into Russia. Russians may want out, but the Estonians, the Latvians, the Hungarians, they don't want in to Russia. So what is the so it doesn't seem to me that the mere presence of NATO is a security risk. This is in support of your point. So what else, what caused this radical flip in 13, 14, 15 that you beautifully illustrated?
Yeah, if I made it appear like there was there's people scholars who argue there's two Putins. There's the early Putin who was cooperating with the West, and there's people in Ukraine who literally believe there are two Putins physically. There are two cells, okay? Okay. But there's also a remarkable consistency between Yeltsin and Putin in terms of Crimea, in terms of Ukraine. It's not an aberration for a Russian to say that Crimea belongs to Russia. Like that's not an aberration. It's not an aberration to say Ukraine belongs to Russia. It's part of, technically, but people get angry when I say this, but it's part of the Soviet Union, right? It was part of the Russian Empire for 200 some odd years, right? So those are real historical realities. And of course, it goes without saying the US and the Soviet Union were in a Cold War for 5 decades, right? So they're adversaries, they're global adversaries. But there are international norms. Few countries can go to the UN Security Council, be denied authorization for a war, and then still invade a country. Maybe there's one country that has the power to do that. Russia is not one of them. So in 2013, there was a world opinion survey, and there's a Nestor group in Ukraine, some leading intellectuals, who said this world opinion survey tells us that there's a new set of Ukrainian values toward self-actualization, participatory democracy, and people having control over their lives. This is a revolutionary moment. That's in 2013. So people who follow it, this is not news to them. This is very common. People started asserting themselves. People were more European-oriented. They had a series of leaders since 1991 who were oligarchs, no matter who supported them, whether they were Western-oriented or Russian-oriented. But there was a new mood in the air. Yanukovych was a failed leader. Even people from Donetsk in the east, where he's from, despised and hated him. He was a mafia-style ruler whose son, who was a dentist, became the wealthiest person in the country, or the second wealthiest person in the country. Factories were shutting down, and he reversed his decision on aligning with the EU. 20 people showed up in early November. On November 30th, they brutally assaulted those 20 people. And because that mood of participatory democracy, Emily Channing Jenkins, I think is her name, wrote Without the State. She's at Harvard University, wrote a great book about this. She was there. She was a participant scholar. It went simply from, we want to sign the EU agreement, and this is literally the slogan, we are here to save our children. We want to save our children. Because of militarized police violence, people wanted Yanukovych out. Then there's the issue of the degree to which oligarchs were or are not able to hold power throughout the country, and what they call channeling the flows. If there was opportunity for someone who was weakened, maybe I can jump in there. Pavel Gubarev was working in a car wash. He became okay. So what I'm trying to, so many complex factors, I'm not even touching on it. So the bottom line is there was a revolution in Ukraine by the people of Ukraine, and they were going to overthrow the government. Everybody who studies the matter understood that, right? We caught up 10 years later, 8 years later. You can't invade countries under international norms. But if there's chaos, and you can argue that another country, that your adversary, clearly is undermining a democratically elected government, you have an excuse. Not to them, again, can get into Putin before Crimea. It was the first time his popularity ratings were declining. They shot up immediately after Crimea. So he had an excuse to go to war. He had a presidency that was on a reset, that I don't want to call weak, I don't like to use that kind of terms, that reacted predictably, at least for Putin, that Obama did not want to provide lethal aid. He dragged his feet on that, and they actually wrote up a plan. This is going to complicate matters. There's two, okay, your national security experts in Ukraine publicly wrote in 2008 or 9 that Russia is looking for a moment, and when the U.S. is weakened, it will invade Ukraine, and that did indeed happen.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Stephen Trynosky from the U.S. Army War College, who will speak on what's old is new, the unexpected return of mass and national mobilization as decisive principles in the Russo-Ukrainian war and possible implications for the NATO alliance. Please.
Thank you very much, and it's an honor to be here. Boy, this really is a very quiet microphone. If I could just ask someone to take a photo, I promised the Public Affairs Office that I would do that, and I forgot to ask someone, so thank you very much.
You told me it was for his
You don't want me.
I don't have one of those. All right. Basically, what I hope to bring to this discussion is just a few things with some trends we're seeing in the war that I think really are imperative to inform any type of informed dialogue in the West about how support for this conflict should shake out, or what the potential options might be. And there's just been a lack of that, just a very serious limitations on industrial capacity, on personnel strength, and also just lines of communication. And I hope to dive into that a little bit during this talk. So thank you for listening. I just have to give my required disclaimer. The opinions contained in this presentation are mine alone and do not represent the United States government, the Department of the Army, or the United States Army War College. Getting those formalities out of the way, I just want to give a little genesis of the inquiry of how late in my life, as somebody who's focused almost exclusively on sub-Saharan Africa, wound up looking at some of these issues in Europe. I was selected to attend the War College for this academic year 23, and I joined a multidisciplinary research project that's being under the aegis of Dr. John Noggle at the War College. And this was in the response to a U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command request to examine lessons learned from Ukraine on both sides of the conflict from open source information. The specific germ of the ask was looking at the very disproportionately high rate of leader losses, both on the commissioned officer side and the non-commissioned officer side. What are those potential implications specifically for the U.S. Army, but by extension our NATO partners? Well, we really went in a lot of different directions, and the research focus considerably expanded, and to include my particular area of focus, which is on just strategic manpower depth. But the overall consensus from the officers working on this project, probably with an average time in service of 22 years, was that this is indeed an inflection point for the United States Army and by extension NATO. Very similar to the comparison of 1973 with the Yom Kippur War, which was another inflection point for the United States Army. And for those who aren't doctrine junkies or maybe don't follow that, that crystallized vast changes, not only in our force structure, our doctrine, material acquisition programs, most of our weapon systems that we use today really came out of a lot of great thinking out of 1973. It led to our active defense doctrine in 1976, which was replaced by air-land battle in 1982, which was really NATO's way of war up until the fall of the USSR. So following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the demise of the Warsaw Pact, I think everyone in this room is informed on it. There was a real post-war zeitgeist within the West. It was a prioritization of technology over end strength, an assumption of air supremacy and uncontested entry in conflicts to come. A shift from the concepts of mass and larger units to smaller brigade-sized units of action, and an increased reliance on special operations forces. That has really been a feature of the past 30 years. And finally, it was a reliance on the reserve components in a way that really hadn't been imagined in the post-World War II era, where because of force cuts, they had become integral parts of the U.S. Army's and by extension, NATO's combat power. So the Russo-Ukrainian War, what's old is new. Russia followed NATO in some ways down some of those paths, and we saw that with some of the flawed initial assumptions of their invasion. They took a extremely small force package into Ukraine. Estimates say that was about 20% of their active duty end strength was committed to the initial invasion, and they had a bunch of assumptions. One of them being they assumed broader support among the Russian diaspora, if you want to call it that, or ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine that failed to crystallize and materialize, much like you were saying. There was an assumption that the U.S. would probably follow a path as it did in 2014. And I think there was, from what I've been able to gather, a real sensitivity to the optics of appearing like the Soviet Army of the past. Although there were many horrible atrocities and things that happened, there was a sensitivity to the destruction of civilian infrastructure and trying to minimize that. I think it's easy to say that this has been a war of surprises. And I think the signature thing from this conflict has been what I call ISR strike. That's been the signature advance of this war. And that has been the utilization of various modalities of intelligence and reconnaissance and surveillance tied to basically a multi-factor strike capacity, whether that's cannon artillery, rocket artillery, airstrikes, drones, et cetera. And that has actually spurred the gravitation of what we're seeing towards urban combat. Right, because if you can't fight out in the open, if you have ISR strike feeds on the NATO side to Ukraine, and Russia isn't there, but they have a very sophisticated capability too, you have to get into those urban defensive belts. And this, of course, brings with it a role of manpower-intensive combat, a reduced role of tactical aviation, and an attritional war of fires. I mean, depending on what source you look at, 75 to 90% of the casualties in this conflict are caused by artillery. And as we'll get further into the talk, that is a real limiting factor that has to be reconciled for Ukraine. General Cavoli, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, said openly that logistics requirements and the casualties exceeded all of NATO's pre-war planning assumptions. And I think the Russian partial mobilization in September 2022 is something I think that really demands some attention being paid to. I find a lot of folks still looking at the conflict through the lens of July and August 2022, but that partial mobilization was a real inflection point. Yes, there were some migration, but they did successfully mobilize 300,000 reservists. They got 80,000 volunteers within the Russian Federation. The U.S. Army's annual recruiting mission is 60,000, by the way, and an unknown number of foreign volunteers, and we've seen some of that with the Wagner organization and other things as well. So I would suggest for the U.S. and for NATO, there are 4 areas of consideration as we assess the current conflict and its future. 1 is the size of the theater. 2 is our current force structure. 3 is the status of our defense industrial base, and 4 is strategic personnel depth, and I will discuss each in turn. We don't have AV here, but what I would have shown if I could was what I call a different view of the theater, and this has been one of the most provocative visuals I have seen. And this is a 2-scale overlay of the Operation Desert Storm operational map from 1991 over eastern Ukraine. The vastness of Ukraine, looking at the Mercator projection, I don't think you can appreciate it. The operational map of Desert Storm is devoured in the vastness of eastern Ukraine. The line of contact currently is about the distance between Washington, D.C. and Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And again, that is something I think in a lot of the discussions in the West, we're just not, we're not appreciating. Because, 31 Abrams tanks is a battalion. For an exquisitely trained battalion who's been in the National Training Center and validated, that's about 10 kilometers of frontage. So, those are very important spatial understandings when we look at, when we hear things about big arrow movements or retaking Crimea or things like that. There's just very practical battlefield calculus that has to be considered. And for the Army and for NATO, this is really Amos Fox. He's an Army strategist. We have to go from thinking in the war of the fishbowl to the war of the pond. For the past 30 years, we've been focused on brigade-level fights, even in larger conflicts like Afghanistan and Iraq. Priorities were there. You had on-call close air support, on-call medical evacuation. The brigade was the center of everything. But one of the most challenging things I've seen with the Bakhmut fight, for example, was credible reports say that the Ukrainians in January had 34 brigades in that area of operations. I believe there are 33 brigades in the United States Army right now. So this is just a vast scale that if NATO or the U.S. were to become embroiled in here or elsewhere, would fundamentally have to change, I think, 30 years of acculturation and training on the part of officers and leaders. Secondly, I wish to talk about force structure considerations. Basically, the all-volunteer force, our current recruiting crisis, basically we are confined to a top-line end strength that's tied to what we can recruit rather than what we need, and we are finding every year, passing year, that what we can recruit to is lower and lower. The Army will probably end this fiscal year 40,000 soldiers fewer than it had 3 years ago, and none of that was by design. That is just through attrition and through diminished recruitment. And what we've seen is a disproportionate cuts, again, with that post-Cold War type of thinking. When the USSR fell, the Army had 218 artillery battalions. We now have 61. The U.S. brigade has 2 firing battalions. The Russian brigade has 3, 2 cannon and 1 rocket. Electronic warfare capabilities. We completely divested that at the division level at the end of the Cold War. We eliminated almost all short-range air defense. That pivot to the brigade-centric force reduced our theater logistics capability, and also, as you know, we reduced our forward presence in Europe. The other thing for the conflict I think that's imperative to understand is what are the implications of the NATO donations. Many of the NATO partners have donated material much in excess proportionately to what the U.S. has. Estonia has divested itself of all of its cannons. All towed artillery from the Netherlands has been donated. The U.K., I think, is giving 35% of its self-propelled guns. Well, in a NATO concept, with the long lead times to replace this equipment, even if there was the will to replace it, where does that burden shift to? Would that fall to the United States in an integrated NATO fight? The third point is to wither the defense industrial base. There was a tremendous consolidation spurred by the Department of Defense to the point where we have really 5 major U.S. defense contractors right now. And with that, there's reduced capacity and throughput. And it's a very different model. And some would argue that it may actually put us from a speed of production standpoint and innovation at a disadvantage to our adversaries. Russia, the Rostec is a state-owned company. Before the war, there was an estimate that they could produce or refit 850 main battle tanks a year. That's credible. The Indian Army rides on Russian tracks, and that's the second biggest army in the world, and they've produced it. And also, we have a very long lead time to replenish our extended stocks. Again, if I had the slide deck here, I would show you from CSIS in Washington the estimate just to get to the pre-war baseline. I think it's 7 years for Javelins, and even with the surge capacity, it's about 5 years for the 155 millimeter artillery shells. And this all has adverse impacts on deterrence and credibility throughout the world for adversaries and well as partners. And finally, I just would like to talk about my own hobby horse, which I'm writing my strategic paper on, which is strategic personnel depth. As I talked about, we're in a persistent recruiting crisis plaguing all 3 components of the active army and dare I say, all components of the military. And it's disproportionate in the combat arms. We had a top-line shortfall last year of a downwardly adjusted target of 25%. But we missed the infantry recruiting mission by over 50%, and we barely hit 50% on the armor and cavalry mission. So while the top line numbers are very bad, in the combat arms, what you're seeing right now is 2 soldiers who are essentially departing service or getting promoted, and 1 coming in the door from the training base. This is a long-term problem that's longitudinal. And I think there's an 8-year contract to be in the Army. Even if you do a 2-year enlistment on active duty, the remaining 6 is spent in the individual ready reserve, which is our strategic manpower pool. And so every soldier not recruited this fiscal year is a mobilization asset we will not have in 2030 and 2031 for a different contingency. So even if we woke up tomorrow and the recruiting crisis was magically repaired and we hit our targets, those undersized cohorts are actually going to have a continuing effect into the next decade. The individual ready reserve is down to about 75,000 soldiers. Those are the young Americans we legally can compel back into uniform, the way the Russians did back in the fall. By contrast, when we went to the all-volunteer force, that force pool was 750,000 in 1973, and in 1994 it was 450,000. So it has really shrunk, and it will continue to shrink. In 1994, also based on some of the Cold War planning assumptions, we changed our guidance for the selective service system. God forbid that would be needed as a national mobilization asset. Prior to 1994, selective service was missioned to, with 13 days after the president signed legislation reauthorizing the draft, selective service would begin flowing inductees for classification and selection. In 1994, by just an administrative stroke of the pen, DOD changed that to M+193. So the current guidance, which hasn't been revisited in 29 years, is that selective service would not even start turning on until D+193. You tack on training of basic training, advanced training, you're looking at 270 days. Okay, so what I call that is a 270-day valley of death, where right now we have a 75,000 soldier thin green line to replace casualties, reconstitute new units, and form an expansion cadre, and also fill the vacancies which we have in the current force. So that's the kind of specific thing that I'm looking at for my area of research inquiry, and it's very concerning, and I don't think it's getting the attention it has. Our NATO partners have many of the same manpower challenges. If I had the visual overlaying the Desert Storm operational map on Ukraine, you will see a UK division, you will see a French division providing screen. Those don't exist anymore in a deployable, to actually, the UK would be incapable of fielding or forward deploying a division. And from what I hear, the French might be in a similar situation. And finally, we have to contrast this with our adversary capabilities. Estimates are that Russia could have as many as 2 million additional mobilizable personnel. And that is something, and the Chinese, obviously, with their size, is something also to look at. So I know this was maybe a little bit longer than I was allotted, but I just wanted to put out this framework on those 4 things, I think, that are just imperative for us to look at as we soberly analyze not only the current situation, but the future. And that's the geographical scope, the force structure changes post-1994, the manpower, and the industrial base. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
So I will only disagree in that you were exactly 15 minutes.
Okay. It seems longer when you're
Florindo, that he set an example for you. Okay. We have time for
I'm Italian.
a question.
I gotta talk.
Question. David.
So, thanks very much. It was hard for me to get my head around a lot of the numbers and things. Can you, just to give me some sense, right? Like if you compared the U.S. Army now with the Ukrainian Army, do you have a sense of like the comparison? Is the U.S. It sounded like the U.S. Army is sort of like a fraction of the Ukrainian Army at this point.
I don't have the current numbers. Sorry, this is completely non-operational at this point. I don't have the current numbers. Right, there we go. Deferred maintenance. No, it's even bigger than the top line numbers, right? Because the Army specifically is by policy is what's the term we use? An executive agent. We're the executive agent for all the services in theater logistics. We're the executive agent for all types of ancillary services. The Corps of Engineers, the Veterinary Corps, many of these types of enablers that aren't counted in the actual combat soldier footprint. So things are even much smaller than even the top line number would seem. Ukraine has a much smaller headcount, but also actually the headcount's the wrong word. They have a much smaller logistical tail just by the nature of their force. They don't have to project forces. They're using interior lines. But that also is a great strain, and something I think I may have been talking with you on the sidebar is with this bric-a-brac donations from the many NATO partners, we are straining that already very tenuous logistical tail. These are secondhand numbers, but I'll relay them for the wow factor. I mean, if you look at the various variants of main battle tanks that are being pledged or donated, there are 10 different types of engines. 6 different types of main gun rounds, and the number I heard, it was either 12 or 15 fire control systems that actually make the tank shoot and traverse and hit targets. I mean, that's breathtaking, right? I mean, we have basically one of each, with our M1 fleet, and we struggle with that, even in simulated training, and to graft that layer of complexity onto a force in contact. Right, that with this tremendous ISR strike capability on the adversary side, it's unbelievable. I've just seen some videos. There's all this stuff on Telegram. I mean, the Ukrainians. I mean, they're very ingenious. I mean, they're taking civilian vans with fuel bladders, and that's the way they're doing some of the undetected refueling in height sites. But yeah, I mean, it briefs well and it looks great. On the front page of the Times or the Post that we're giving these 31 tanks, but the attendant challenges with arming them and fixing and fueling them can't be discounted. Thank you.
One quick question, and then we're going to move on, please. And epigrammatic.
It's actually 2 questions, but they're both very brief. First, does the US have the necessary industrial base to both rebuild and then maintain its military advantage over challenges, not just like Russia, but like China going forward? And secondly, can there be a winner in this war? Or is this really a war of attrition that neither side, neither Russia nor Ukraine, are likely to win?
Yeah, I think all one has to do is just look at C-SPAN from this week with the House and Senate testimony from the chairman and the Secretary of Defense, and I think that really says it all. And it's certainly from a shipbuilding capacity, we're at a severe disadvantage. And again, our industrial base, it's just a different model. For ammunition, it's government-owned, contractor-operated. So the government owns the plants and the machinery, but contractors operate it, and that's just a very different proposition, to be able to scale. I don't want to, even though this is my own personal, I don't want to go too far down the road of the other questions, but I do think, there is a finite amount of resources, I think, that are even available or can be manufactured in the near term. And there's a few tells with that you can just see. The press releases, we're no longer saying how many various types of rounds. That was a big thing. We were saying to kind of maybe show our robust capability, but things have been very, very quiet on that. I think Ukraine, again, from what I've heard, is down to about 300 artillery pieces in an artillery war. It's a very challenging situation. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, one more round of applause, please. Our third speaker is Florindo Volpacchio from the Telos-Paul Piccone Institute, a longtime friend of Telos, and he will be speaking on what we got here is a failure to communicate. War and misrecognition. Is there a critical theory of war? Florindo.
Okay, I'm the odd man out here. Back to the roots. You may be wondering why I'm asking if there's a critical theory of war. Well, because war is the father of all things. But that's not Schmidt talking, that's Nietzsche, cribbing from Heraclitus, who then added what sounds like something that could have come from Horkheimer and Adorno out of the dialectic of enlightenment, that war is also the means to a culture that pursues barbarism for the sake of culture. Apparently, either Nietzsche anticipated Horkheimer and Adorno's critique of modernity, or they just played out their roles as part of the eternal recurrence. Nevertheless, while Nietzsche was not that far off in years, relatively speaking, from Horkheimer and Adorno, they were separated by a war that came to sow the seeds of modernity. But critical theory was not born out of one war, but actually two. The first being one that reflected its contemporaries of dying, if not decadent, European age at the turn of the 20th century, one that was fighting a war over a reified sense of national culture steeped in hierarchical pretensions. Then Horkheimer and Adorno experienced an even more barbaric one, not soon after that, one that sought to overcome and revive a dying European culture by asserting a racial superiority as the answer for the troubles of the Western world. With old beliefs having fallen into disrepute and blamed for the collapse of Western society, Nietzsche's ascetic ideal had come home to roost. Critical theory confronted ideologies, whether Nazism or Stalinism, that sought to impose themselves through a rational terror. Yet as much as Horkheimer and Adorno sought to identify the barbarity of the modern age, it was never explicitly in war itself, or at least in its own self-understanding. As survivors and witnesses to this barbarism, Horkheimer and Adorno continue to identify the cultural critique of the modern age through its pursuit of an instrumental reason. Borrowing from Hegel's critique of the Enlightenment and the inherent terror in the rationality of utility, and probably also his philosophy of history with its cunning of reason, wherein history is a butcher's block, Horkheimer and Adorno articulated a cultural critique of the barbarism of the modern age as essentially wars over culture. It was a culture which historically allowed the emergence of modern subjectivity separated from the powers and freedom of individual wills. It was a modern subjectivity which at the same time was alienated, estranged, reified, call it what you will, but basically was set up as its own article of faith, devoid of particularity of subjectivity, any kind of subjectivity that emerged out of the normative foundations of a community. Rather, what was posited upon the modern particular individual were norms shaped by the ideological subjectivity of modern authoritarian states, administrative states, or the capitalist marketplace. This is the independent spectator of modernity. From Smith to Schopenhauer, imposing the aesthetic ideal, its own socio-pathological tastes through authoritarian dictates either of the laws of the state or of the marketplace. If war in the modern age continues to be some kind of Volksgemeinschaft wherein we identify nationhood through its foreign campaigns, those campaigns are consistently being rationalized through the identity of a cultural enemy. Not one who threatens to subjugate or enslave us for imperial purposes, not one who is an existential threat, but one who seeks to destroy our identity. If earlier wars were allegedly rationalized in the name of freedom, they now appear to be increasingly fought in the name of the protection of our identity. The enemy we identify has increasingly become a cultural enemy, one who threatens the American way of life or is fighting a jihad against the West. Despite Putin's own fears of NATO at his doorstep threatening his control over Eastern Europe, increasingly he has posed the war in Ukraine and the one against the West as a war against Western values, not those of freedom and democracy, but against the spread of what Putin has railed as the cultural decadence of the West that threatens Russian Orthodox values. The cultural wars and identity politics are more real than you think. It's just that they are pursued to the violence rendered on the international stage. For the critical theory of Horkheimer and Adorno, the critique of the barbarism of rationality was not sustainable with the development of post-World War II prosperity. The management of capitalism's legitimation crises through the political state, the emergence of international agencies, global markets, the shift to proxy wars over emerging post-colonial countries, and battles over geographical spheres of influence. Consequently, it should not be surprising that what emerged from this, once the mantle of critical theory was given to Habermas, that the approach to international conflicts took on one of the element of discourse ethics. The defense of individual freedom and the emancipatory interest here became linked to human rights and dignity through a cosmopolitanism drawn from Kant and Arendt. Identified at various times as cosmopolitics or cosmopolitanism, it sought to identify a normative political discourse through identification of individual subjectivity in a context that superseded state and nationhood, if not the cultural formation of the individual. Basically, in the work of Habermas and some of his followers, like Celia Ben-Habib, you have the conversion of critical theory to a defense of human rights and its moralization as human dignity, and the development from this of something which called itself critical international theory, identified in the work of Jürgen Haecki. Here, the belief emerges that human rights are uncontroversial as a defense for protecting the emancipatory interest. Human rights appear to be a way to posit a democratic ethos through normative discourse that transcends state and nationhood, to posit a global politics through a global society, to create some kind of cosmopolitan democracy. But to be argumentative, to no one's surprise, that's not the case. Human rights are at best self-legislating activities, laws we pass on to ourselves, derived from ourselves, but given legitimacy through some kind of transcendent belief in unquestionable values. Even on the international stage, human rights as a concept in itself is actually counterintuitive to discourse ethics. Its norms derive from self-proclaimed freedoms that are imposed on others and presumed to be rational and ethical in themselves. Consequently, it is nothing more than the modern version of natural law. The concept of world citizenship founded on human rights, therefore, is really an oxymoron. If you believe the notion of citizenship emerges out of a community existing with familial, if not social bonds, which is capable of thereby constituting governing laws. In this case, human rights is the irrational and what is not actual. It is self-defeating and not possible of imminent critique. But beyond this conceptual argument, the argument for human rights as a means of defending global freedom collapses in the usual practical arguments, lack of juridical and institutional enforcement. For all of the breaking headlines that we've seen of Putin being made into a war criminal for transporting children out of the Ukraine to Russia, his ability then to travel to Mariupol is simply his demonstration to all of us of his ability to continue with the banality of his evil. The protection of human rights and human dignity for now will not prevent wars or justify wars. Whether it was in Yugoslavia, Syria, the Kurds, we've always seen how we've backed off whenever we've drawn supposedly the line on human rights. Human rights, however defined, are based on the cultural formation that takes place with one state and nation, reflecting both the moral and juridical aspirations of its members. To then apply them to a community that sublates, if not transcends the state, is nonsensical. To put it bluntly, nations and societies will not go to war over human rights. So where does this leave critical theory? One of Habermas's heirs, Axel Honneth, so-called third generation, we're now on part 3, with his concept of recognition, appears to provide an approach for critical theory for the understanding of war beyond the discoursed ethics of Habermas's cosmopolitanism. Influenced again by Hegel, Honneth explicitly uses the discussion of the master-slave relationship, and probably also how he read it through the eyes of Kojève, to understand the sources of human conflict, while at the same time identifying as a source for social being and intersubjectivity. This is rather ironic that the struggle for recognition in the master-slave relation reemerges as a source for understanding modern social conflicts, given its initial influence on Western Marxism as a possible metaphor for class struggle. Regardless of its failing in that context, I ask the question, can its use for understanding the struggle between social groups be used to understand the struggles between states? Can its use for establishing the legitimacy of modern freedom among individuals be applied to international relationships? Some, like Jürgen Hake, have taken this concept of recognition and applied it to international relations, especially when Honneth drew on the concept of respect as a way of eliminating barriers to international relations. If social conflicts emerge out of disrespect, could this also not then apply to states? This at least seemed intuitively a bit more viable approach for critical theory. But at this point, and I will speak as an Italian here, let me just say the word respect is a very loaded term for me. Culturally, for me, it means a show of deference to authority. If you don't believe me, go watch The Godfather. Nevertheless, for Honneth, disrespect appears to be the viable source for conveying social conflict, but not from failure to provide mutual recognition, as Honneth would believe, but from what I think is a failure to defer to authority. If the failure to show respect in international relations leads to war, here I would fall on the side of Nietzsche and argue it's from the failure to recognize power, the failure to communicate, the lack of respect or recognition of others is simply the failure, as we saw happen to the stubborn and resistant prisoner played by Paul Newman in Cool Hand Luke. It's nothing more than the ability to inflict enough pain to force the capitulation of the other. But even if we took Honneth's notion of respect as a moral acknowledgement of mutual recognition, conceptually, when you bring this to the level of international relations, the concept of recognition collapses. What is the cultural formation of international order that would bring states together? At this point, that culture remains bound by the juridical self-recognition of sovereignty as the basis of the legitimacy of the political organization of states. In short, we are still bound by the systems of states as nationhood, and in the international order, the state continues to pursue self-legislating activity. Can a global market transcend this? Not to the extent that domestic sovereign law continues to be the basis for even international law. The Euro crisis and Brexit did more to demonstrate the fragility of international relations than the war in the Ukraine. However, the theory of recognition fails to provide a source for critical theory for another reason, and one that specifically goes back to the source of the theory itself. For Hegel, the mutual recognition that takes place between wills, whether in conflict or in love, takes place within the cultural formation of society. That is broadly called in German Bildung, a difficult word to capture in English, but in its own gestalt, it is understood as the education, cultural formation, social pedagogy, institutional presence of relationships, all that shape an individual's social existence. In the phenomenology, Hegel explicitly posits the possibility of the existence of the state in the ground established by Bildung. The state is its cultural formation. Consequently, the possibility of mutual recognition as some kind of intersubjective constitutive moment requires the state. As for Hegel himself, while he may have thought of his philosophy as own time comprehended in thought, it clearly took flight with the oncoming dusk of modernity, conveying something which continues for now to capture our own time. To use his own dramatic metaphor, the state is the march of God on earth. But let me just say here, Hegel is not beyond dumbing down his own ideas in his lectures to communicate a thought to his students, something we're all familiar with, even if in the end it appeared to fail to convey his actual concept. Nevertheless, as a critic of Kant's argument for perpetual peace, for Hegel, state emerged as the ultimate embodiment of the subjective free will of its members, one in which it defended the freedom of its members as a polity. Yes, he understood war as probably the only way we ever transcended individual freedom to understand freedom in itself. And so for this, the state had to be prepared for war to defend its freedom. And for this purpose, argued for the maintenance of a standing army in which all citizenry would serve, which would answer your problem. For critical theory, this is a problem when the state is the cultural embodiment of a rationality that is not only repressive with regard to the differences that exist among its people, but seeks to eliminate those differences through terror, repression, or juridical fiat. Consequently, critical theory at this point seems incapable of providing a critique of war to the extent that it keeps presenting itself as an attempt to derive a moral theory to address social conflicts. But perhaps bring it back to some kind of an original Nietzschean element in it, a more polemical and acerbic approach than even Hegel could provide, could give us an answer to where the battle lines should be drawn, if I may so speak. Unfortunately, Horkheimer and Adorno failed to take their appropriation of Hegel to its conclusion and see the cultural barbarity of modernity as the activity of states and not just ideologies. This is where they fell short. The critique of fascism and capitalism merged social and economic problems, and except for the Weberian critique of the administrative state, the modern political state by default was simply a superstructure encumbered by some kind of fascist or capitalist ideology. There was little critique of political or juridical institutions as constitutive components of the state that could also define its actions. Fascism in Italy, for example, was quite different from fascism in Spain. For one thing, it wasn't as closely aligned with the Roman Catholic Church. But perhaps if Horkheimer and Adorno had given more thought to Newman and Kirchheimer and paid attention to them, they could have extended their cultural critique to the critique of the state and understood the role it plays in our cultural formation.
2 minutes.
Instead, I'm almost done, critical theory went the other way, exploring the psychological dimensions of the sickness. Here, perhaps it was more Nietzschean than Hegelian. Unfortunately, the ongoing absence of a political theory in critical theory, beyond the critique of ideology, is what has hampered its progress. Furthermore, since at least the Vietnam War, we've all come to understand that the propaganda of war itself as a subconscious way of winning hearts and minds has come to be the way in which we've approached to understand the ability to take on war. In this sense, Horkheimer and Adorno's original critique has gone mainstream. The enemy is no longer what threatens us existentially, but again, what threatens us culturally. Cultural critique then needs to encumber the cultural actions of the state as it tries to define its identity. Within this possibility lies a critical theory of war. If modern war is cultural war, how does that cultural identity reflect the recognition upon which the state is founded? As so often happens for those states who initiate war, the attack on the cultural enemy without is more often than not actually an attack on the cultural enemy within. If the wars of modernity have made us question anything, is whether such wars do reflect our cultural identity. Thank you.
Also on the nose, 15 minutes. Thank you. Questions, especially for Florindo, first of all, and then we'll go into a general discussion. Please.
Yeah, thank you, Florindo. Very thought-provoking. I share your skepticism about theories of recognition. Hegel clearly didn't want to use a theory of recognition to ground his ethical theory, if there is one, right? He spoke of ethical life and the philosophy of right, and there you see the state seemed to be the final, if you like, theater of recognition should it take place within people sharing a common form of life, culture, and so forth. So, yeah, it seems like the theorists of recognition want to use it as the basis of a kind of revamped cosmopolitanism and so forth.
Well, it's a revamped discursive way to approach discursive ethics without the inherent problems of discourse.
Right, right. So, having said that, though, there does seem to be evidence. So, if you look at ethical life, particularly civil society, it's not a phrase that Hegel uses, but
What, civil society? Yes, Bürgerliche Gesellschaft.
Well, oh no, not civil society, but
Jay, could you get to the question, because there are other people that want to ask.
sorry. Is there a global dimension to ethical life? Hegel seemed to suggest there was such a possibility imminent in civil
Well,
society.
if you want to take it to the international level, there are a couple of things I'll just quickly answer that you can bring up if we're talking about Hegel. For one is that one way the the crisis you often had in the marketplace and the system of needs was resolved through international imperialism, not through the state, but markets went internationally to address the problems that came out of economic culture. When it comes to, there are several passages in which Hegel's against cosmopolitanism in the sense of the Kant's critique of perpetual reason, but at the same time, if it becomes necessary, how should I put this? I mean, there is an element there in which an international identity is achieved through international relationships. But at this point, he's still dealing with the level of states in which, for him, the state has the same characteristics, at least in the phenomenology, as an individual. And he talks about it in that sense. But that's precisely because he wants to be able to talk about, when it comes to war, he wants to talk about it literally as a life and death struggle. He pretty much takes the kind of dynamic you did have in the master-slave relationship and the formation of consciousness and brings it to the international level. That, what we confront in war is death. And that's his reality.
Okay. Well, next
Yeah.
question over here for Florindo, and after that, the floor is open for any questions.
Okay. No, I actually had a question for Stephen. Is that
Let me
okay?
ask, is there any specific Florindo question first? Yes? Then pass it back.
So talking about the military industrial basis and its expansion so as to fulfill the needs of the Western alliance, don't you think that the American policy in that regard in the last 30 years and maybe even before that has been detrimental to its development insofar as, for example, in the case of Europe, the attempts coming from France, especially in France, to develop such an autonomous industrial basis were met with a lot of hostility in the US, taking it as a sort of threat to American leadership, and I think for very bad reasons. And doesn't that explain today the difficulty in Europe to replenish our stock of weapons?
Well, that's really with the whole situation with Australia with the submarines. That's really ripped from their front pages. A little bit different, than this, but I'm glad you brought that discussion to the fore. Yeah, I think it's unquestioned that there's certainly an element to that. But a lot of the stockpiling and the ordering. There's only a certain shelf life, 20 to 30 years for artillery ammunition. Those were divestment decisions that were made, all through NATO. And so I don't think anyone's blameless on it. But boy, I'm glad you brought that issue up. Yep, I appreciate your concerns about it.
I want to follow up on that. As I understand it, the U.S. expenditures in defense are significantly higher as percentage of GDP compared to European allies, they're around 4%. So how come we don't have any stuff left?
Those were decisions that happen. Defense industrial base is, one of those perennial things that end up getting cut. On the initial budget that gets submitted, that's an area for savings potentially is seen. And it's not one would think based on those very high top line numbers, but that was a donor budget line item perpetually over the year.
So in fact, it's not being spent.
No, it was allocated elsewhere. I mean, that's essentially it. I mean, we ran into, I forget the year. I mean, there was a year in Afghanistan and Iraq where we ran into coming very close shortages on the 155 rounds. So this has been even in very limited wars. This has been an issue before, but nothing on this scale.
Questions? Over here, Mark.
Yeah. Sorry, I mean, it's on. Yeah. I just can't hear it myself. So I'm really, I feel like I'm just adding to the litany of questions to you on this question, and I feel perhaps that there's things you don't want to answer because they're speculative. But I mean, this was my thought in my head listening to your talk is the question of what is going to happen now, and yeah, I absolutely understand if you say I can't speculate, but it seems to me that there's no way forward now but for NATO countries to begin a really drastic campaign of rearmament, increasing their industrial production capacity, and also, I mean, just to replace what they've given to Ukraine for a start, but also it appears the security situation now calls for far more materiel than they had previously. So, but I don't know if you want to touch that. If you haven't been said, I'd appreciate it.
No, I mean that's why I wanted to bring these things that are often overlooked. These are just the practical, the geometry, the calculus of warfare that just get overlooked. And again, I'm not claiming any type of special expertise on any of this, but it's just something I followed closely. No, but it would take such a significant amount of time. First of all, just even building the machines to even build these end items. I mean, I think I read this yesterday. I think for us to get to 85,000 rounds of 155 shells a month, I think we can do that in 2028. Now, I mean, the Russians are firing, 20,000 rounds a day some days. Some days they're firing 10. But the bottom line is, even if they're only shooting 10, I mean, that's 5 years to get us to a production level that is a week and change for them. These are, very, very serious questions.
I have one question. If we were actually on a war economy, could that be expedited? I mean, are the numbers you're quoting us basically?
Speak into the microphone.
Sorry. Are the statistics you're quoting us based on the economy existing as it is now, or is it based, if we had a war economy that has converted our plants, could that be expedited?
This is the surge projections that DOD has come up with, but also the CSIS, one of the think tanks in DC. If we had AV, I would have showed that chart of what steady state is and what surge is. But I mean, it's the issue of having the machines to actually fabricate these things. It's the manpower piece.
Well, the reason I asked that is during COVID, it seemed like we were able to start, manufacturing what we needed pretty quickly. And I just wonder if that could be translated in a situation, in a real situation of war.
Oh, I'm sure in a national survival exigent crisis, I'm sure a lot of that slack could probably be knocked out of the system, but it would still take a vast amount of time, and there'd be that production valley of death.
Casey?
This one's for Florindo. Might be a simplistic question, but based on what I gleaned from your talk, it sounds like the critical theorist needs a state.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, look, you basically had a couple of divides in critical theory, the way I look at it. You had the sort of philosophers, sociologists, aesthetic theorists with Horkheimer, Adorno, Benjamin, and then you had, psychologists with Fromm, and then you had, Kirchheimer and Neumann, who had their own wing. So for somehow Neumann, Kirchheimer, Neumann's behemoth, which actually apparently I've seen some references to it lately. Maybe it's coming back to he's coming back, but that wing, that sort of juridical wing of critical theory that focused on studying the state seemed to have got lost. And it seems like Adorno and Horkheimer never really included the work that they did, especially, you take Neumann's work on Behemoth, and his other work on his other studies on juridical state, and Kirchheimer's as well, into consideration in their own work. But to me, it's probably just two different sensibilities, and maybe one in which reflects their background and their training. I'm not sure. Various arguments can go, but yeah, at this point, and I'm not the only one who said it, critical theory lacks a political theory.
David? This is the problem with Marxism, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it lacks a political theory.
Yeah. Well.
And the state is subsumed to something that, even in critical theory, I think, which is assumed to be some kind of, superstructure without any appreciation of its own existence as what it is. I mean, it is a cultural entity, but I use it in the sense that Hegel approaches it as a cultural entity. But that's another discussion.
I guess I wanted to follow up with Stephen a little bit. Just, we heard the talk before by Mark about kind of the role of a kind of national security apparatus in kind of perpetuating a certain kind of war footing for political reasons, I guess maybe domestic reasons. But from what you're saying, the causality goes the other way. The procurement process is really very much has really I don't know. It's gone to sort of diminishing of procurement and I guess a withering of that kind of industrial capacity. Is that your understanding? And that the push is really seems. I mean, where is the push for building stuff? I guess for the military, is it coming from or the non-push, right? Is it coming from a kind of political consensus? Is it coming from some parts of the military bureaucracy? I'm just I don't really know about the whole procurement process and who makes decisions about what gets built, what doesn't get built, and yes, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think there's tremendous, vested interests and lobbying in future weapons and next generation or next generation after next generation technology. But I think what we're seeing here, that's why I'm saying, what's old is new. It's these quotidian things, right? That don't have the advocacy, right? I mean, building 155 shells. That's General Dynamics, I think, has the contract to do that in Iowa, the finished product, but it's a government-owned facility. I mean, I'm sure there's a good profit rake on it, but it's nothing like from an R&D standpoint for a long-term expenditure investment standpoint. It's nothing like that for them. And I'm just picking that as one example. So that's the kind of thing I think we've maybe let our eye off the ball with because of assumptions, right? We just came up with these new strategic assumptions following the demise of the USSR.
Can I just follow up on that? Or?
Yeah, okay, and then there's one more.
Okay, so I'm just wondering. So when you say we took our eye off the ball, who's the we? Who's making the decisions? It's like, obviously it's not the defense contractors that pushing it. I guess it's somebody else that's kind of making those decisions, right?
Well, I mean, this is policy decisions, within the various departments that submit their requirements. That goes up to the Department of Defense. There's all types of offsets that we need to trim in this budget line to fund this one. I mean, it's just the inherent nature of prioritization. But much like some of the manpower considerations, these are just things without a deep advocacy base for it, if you will.
Okay. Okay. Back there, and then George.
Yeah, quick question again. Because there was a question about why is there such a high defense expenditure, but the stuff is not there. How much of the defense budget is always spent on personnel? The social welfare within the Army, VA services, all of that, wages, location. I mean, it seems to me that's, extraordinary amount. And also, does that keep going up, or are there cuts like we see social services outside the military as well?
I mean, rough, it's about a third. I mean, give or take, and there's different budget line items you could probably put into the personnel thing that may take it up to 42%. But it's roughly a third.
Kind of constant.
It's pretty much constant. But again, when you think about if we curl people into units here, right? The cost per unit is extremely high. I mean, the pay scale, despite common understanding. I mean, for entry level, dare I say, unskilled when they come into the Army labor, I mean, that's a very good compensation package. Non-contributory retirement plan, full health care. Limitless despite how big your family is, the gold-plated GI Bill that'll send you to NYU without having to pay a nickel, and then they'll give you a $4,000 a month housing allowance tax-free on top of that, right? And these bonuses. I mean, these enlistment bonuses. I mean, we're giving $50,000 enlistment bonus for combat soldiers, and we're doing $35,000 on top of that for the quick. I mean, but as I said, this was a think tank event in D.C. I'd asked a very pointed question to Rand. If that compensation package is not moving the needle to get us even half of the infantrymen we need, or barely half of our cavalry scouts, what more can we throw at this? I don't know, and that's the question. But yeah, personnel is probably about third, and the VA disability, that's a separate budget line. The disability is that's mandatory spending, just like Social Security or Medicare. VA healthcare, running the hospitals, the brick and mortar, that's an appropriated budget. But VA disability is automatic mandatory spending.
Okay. We thought about the prisons? No.
Would you care to comment what the Army is doing, or the Pentagon, so far as artificial intelligence is concerned?
I'm not an expert in that. I do have a friend of mine, Colonel Choi, who's working on the AI team down in Arlington, Virginia on that. I think that's where they're hoping to put as much capacity in as they can to offset, some of these very real personnel shortfalls and some of those gaps. And if you read the Army professional literature, right, the Army Magazine or Army Sustainment or Military Review, I mean, these are AI. It's every second article. But I know that's something they're putting a lot of investment in. But the issue is with this war, I think, especially with these brutal urban fights, this is just a human element of war. Where it is just close combat with, a sergeant. Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Russians, they've done a lot of innovations. They started the war with the battalion tactical group, and I would encourage you to read it. I could maybe send a link to a very excellent piece on this. They've created these assault detachments. These battalion-sized assault detachments, where they're using thermobaric weapons and to clear. I mean, this is a level of human-scale warfare. Where, it is very young people are being put in this situation. And the decentralization of authority. Part of this, the Russians, not just call for fire, but targeting authority in these assault detachments for artillery has been decentralized to the company commander captain level, and the mortars for lieutenants. Not, I need help. This is the target. What sensor is available, what shooter is available, strike. And that's just a level with information technology, with knowledge management. A lot of these decisions have been hoovered up gradually over the past, 30, 40, 50 years. But we're seeing actually the nature of these fights that, at least on the Russian side, a tremendous decentralization that we'd actually be following their lead on. But we may have to go in that direction.
Steve, just to this point, the vast majority of AI research in the United States is directly or indirectly through the NSA.
Joe?
The NSA.
NSA, right?
Yeah. Including some I enjoy.
Okay. I have actually two questions, but I'm only going to concentrate on one for Carl. The one for Stephen would have to do with the draft, but we don't have time to deal with that.
Oh, that's a great one.
You do Carl, and then he'll do the draft.
Somebody else can take that up with their time. But for Carl, to what extent might there actually be more to Putin's irredentism than just the sort of messianic vision he has about, Orthodox Russia and tradition and history and so on and so forth, and the loss of the empire? Might there also be another part of that, to the extent that Putin is actually concerned with the sort of decadence of Russian society? And by that, I don't mean mirroring the West, but the fact that there might be an ethos, the lack of a value system, a lack of initiative there, that he's trying to revive through this type of new pride in Russia, and to perhaps stem what he sees as the inner collapse, the cultural collapse, whatever, of Russia itself.
I don't know if there's an element that the culture of Russia has collapsed, but the intrusion, this is from Putin's mindset, of European values, particularly homosexuality. Read Lavrov. I'm missing.
Yeah, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about looking at a society that is, economically, it's not, competitive with the West. It's not providing the prosperity. There's not the initiative there. Well, there's a kind of stagnation,
and that he's trying to instill. I'm not using it as a justification. I'm just trying to understand his mentality here.
But he's ripped the country apart.
So-
I mean, he's stolen so much from the country, and
Oh yes,
the
I
oligarchs steal so much.
I
mean,
understand
why do you
that.
expect
I don't think they're
Hold on.
incompatible. But
Are you want to speak on this issue? On this issue? Or a separate question? All right, separate question. No, let's Joe, you finished? Do you want to respond to Joe? Okay. Last question.
Oh, we're not going to do the draft?
I can say we're not.
Okay, my question is for Florindo. My
Okay.
question is for Florindo, but
Please ask Florindo your question, and then we're going to declare war.
okay, good. Thank you. So it still has to do with war, and basically, I found your presentation very insightful. But one direction in which it prompted me to think is about possible relation between critical theory and what could be called global theory. Now, of course, critical theory has some global dimension. Anyway, when you mention Hegel, and of course, we know that this idea of the unfolding of the absolute spirit has certain global kind of dimension.
Sorry. Let me just add. People in UN are actually using Habermas to write international political theory.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it really exists. It's practically being used by people in the UN.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Habermas is in its discourse ethics. It's not something that's just an academic exercise. But sorry, go ahead.
Yes. So I wanted to say that, of course, almost everybody thinks that Hegel's thinking is perhaps a global thinking, but indeed, if it ends with something like, okay, still the unfolding of the absolute spirit kind of end up in the Prussian monarchy as the perfect emanation of this global spirit.
No, I disagree. But go ahead.
Okay. But anyway, so I was just thinking that the idea of global, if it is explicitly mentioned as part of a theory, will by definition exclude war somehow. But from the very beginning, exclude war from any theoretical justification.
For Hegel?
Hmm?
You're saying for Hegel, does it exclude war?
You get to the question so we can answer.
Okay. No, this is what I'm suggesting. A possible link. Could you possibly think of a link between critical theory and global theory? Because I believe that I somehow think that the idea of global will, by definition, exclude the idea of war from theory, and.
Florindo, do you want to comment?
Because it will have to.
Critical theory innately global.
Is it innately global? My gut reaction, yes, it is, to the extent that if from a cultural critique, yes, it is, but it's flawed. It's flawed because at least the way we approach it, the way it's taught here, it lacks a political theory. It has no, Habermas has tried to do that in Germany, but it's fallen short. And it's not something most people have picked up on. What they have picked up on is trying to turn it into some kind of cosmopolitanism. That's where you've seen it being applied in some kind of political sense. But again, as I tried to argue, that's a fallacy because, cosmopolitanism still, at least it doesn't exist. I mean, still as we're still living in, the time of Westphalia, we're still living in a system of states. Mm-hmm. And, that's where sovereignty is placed. We've lost, critical theory needs to develop a concept of sovereignty. Okay, let's start there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
Round of applause for the panel.